What if opening one tomb could be followed by one of the deadliest invasions in human history? In June 1941, a group of Soviet scientists arrived in Samarkand, Uzbekistan. They were not searching for gold. They were not looking for treasure. They had come for something much stranger. They wanted to open the tomb of Timur, the man known in the West as Tamerlane. He had been dead for more than 500 years, but his name still carried fear across Central Asia, Persia, India, and the Middle East. Timur had once been remembered as one of history's most terrifying conquerors. Cities had fallen before his armies, kings had feared his name, and long after his death, his legend remained sealed inside the stone walls of the Gur-e-Amir mausoleum. But before the tomb was open, the scientists were warned. Local people told them not to touch the grave. They said Timur's resting place carried an old warning, a warning so dark that it sounded almost impossible to believe. Whoever opens my tomb will open the way for a conqueror more terrible than me. The scientists heard the warning, but they did not turn back. And that is where the mystery begins. Because shortly after Timur's tomb was opened, something happened that turned this story into one of the strangest legends of the Second World War. 2 days later, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. Was it only a coincidence, or did the opening of Timur's tomb create one of the darkest stories ever connected to the war? To understand why this legend became so powerful, we have to begin with the man inside the tomb. Timur was not an ordinary ruler. He was one of the most feared conquerors the world had ever seen from Central Asia. He built a vast empire. His armies marched across Persia, the Caucasus, India, and the Middle East. Where his armies went, cities fell. Where his name was spoken, rulers listened. And even centuries after his death, his memory still lived in Samarkand. His body rested inside the Gur-e-Amir mausoleum, a place of stone, silence, and legend. For centuries, people believed that some graves should never be disturbed. But in 1941, Soviet authorities were not interested in fear. They were interested in science. They wanted to study Timur's remains. They wanted to confirm historical details, and they wanted to reconstruct the face of the man behind the legend. The expedition included the famous Soviet anthropologist Mikhail Gerasimov. He was known for rebuilding the faces of historical figures from their skulls. To him, the tomb was not a curse, it was evidence. It was history, waiting to be examined. But to the local people, it was something very different. It was a sealed warning from the past. According to the legend, elders told the scientists not to open the grave. Some versions say the warning was written inside the tomb. Others say it had been passed down through generations. But the meaning was always the same. Do not disturb Timur, because if his tomb is opened, a greater disaster will follow. Still, the scientists continued. The stone was lifted. The sealed grave was opened, and inside lay the remains of Timur, the conqueror whose name had outlived many of the empires he destroyed. Some accounts say that when the tomb was opened, a heavy smell filled the chamber. To the scientists, it may have been the scent of old oils, resins, and embalming materials. But to those who believed in the legend, it felt like something ancient had been released. A tomb that had slept for centuries was awake again, and then came the detail that made the story impossible to forget. Timur's tomb was opened in June 1941. 2 days later, on June 22nd, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa. Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. Millions of German soldiers crossed the border. Tanks rolled east, aircraft filled the sky, cities burned. Armies were surrounded, and the Soviet Union entered one of the darkest chapters of the Second World War. Now, the first question returns. Did the tomb cause the invasion? Historically, the answer is no. Hitler's invasion had been planned long before Timur's tomb was opened. German forces had already prepared their strategy, their supplies, and their attack lines. The war did not begin because Soviet scientists opened a grave in Samarkand. But that is not why the legend survived. The legend survived because the timing was terrifying. The warning was ignored. The tomb was opened, and 2 days later, A new conqueror came from the west. For many people, that coincidence was too powerful to forget. But the story does not end there. There is another part of the legend. According to some versions, Timur's remains were later returned to Samarkand and reburied according to Islamic tradition. Some people say this happened before the Soviet victory at Stalingrad, and after Stalingrad, the direction of the war began to change. So another question appeared. Was the curse broken when Timur was reburied again? History gives a different answer. Stalingrad was not won because of a broken curse. It was won through sacrifice, through strategy, through suffering, through soldiers and civilians who endured one of the most brutal battles in human history. But legends do not live only on facts. They live on patterns. First, the tomb was opened. Then, the invasion began. Later, the remains were reburied. Then, the war began to turn. That pattern made people remember the story. And that is why the curse of Timur still fascinates people today. It stands between fact and myth. On one side, there is history. Soviet scientists opened Timur's tomb in 1941. 2 days later, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. Timur's remains were later returned to Samarkand. But on the other side, there is legend. A dead conqueror warned the living not to disturb his grave. They ignored him, and then a more terrible conqueror appeared. Maybe there was no curse. Maybe there was only timing, only fear, only the human need to find meaning in disaster. But some stories survive because they make us ask uncomfortable questions. Why do people fear opening old tombs? Why do warnings from the past feel so powerful? And why do some coincidences feel too dark to be accidental? Timur's tomb may have held only bones, but the legend around it held something far stronger. Memory, fear, and the terrifying idea that history is never completely dead. It waits in ruins. It waits beneath stone. It waits inside stories people are afraid to forget. So perhaps the real question is not whether Timur's curse was real. The real question is this. When Soviet scientists opened that tomb in 1941, did they uncover history, or did they give the world one of its darkest coincidences?